The UK has committed to sending a massive aid package of 120,000 cutting-edge drones to heat up the battlefield in Eastern Europe for Ukraine. This covers everything from reconnaissance drones to long-range strike platforms, and they'll start arriving at the Ukrainian front lines in phases starting early next month. At the exact same time, thousands of miles away from the Eastern European theater, the US military is quietly and permanently pulling all of its troops out of northeastern Syria. These two events are pretty interesting to talk about, so let's break them down one by one, starting with the UK. London's move to flood Ukraine with hundreds of thousands of drones is a direct response to the escalating war in Eastern Europe. Based on recent data, Moscow launched around 6,500 one-way attack or kamikaze drones just in March of this year alone. That number is forcing the Western Bloc to completely shift their logistical and defense strategies. UK Defense Secretary John Healey brought this commitment to the 34th Ukraine Defense Contact Group meeting in Berlin, securing a continued aid package for Ukraine. Tactically speaking, these 120,000 drones are going to change how Ukrainian infantry fight and defend. A huge chunk of this massive contract went to domestic UK manufacturing companies like Tekover, Windracers, and Malloy Aeronautics. From a defense economic standpoint, this is a really smart move. By pumping money into local industries, the UK is effectively reviving its military manufacturing capacity, creating thousands of new jobs, and making sure their supply chains are ready for high-intensity conflict scenarios in the future. The clearest example of this technological leap is the twin-engined HCMC cargo platform made by Windracers. This drone has a proven track record, especially after successfully landing on a Royal Navy aircraft carrier back in 2023. In a real combat scenario, logistics drones like this can deliver ammo and medical supplies straight to the frontline trenches without risking the lives of logistics troops under heavy artillery fire. But in an actual conflict, of course, this is going to face serious challenges from electronic warfare systems. Standard GPS signals and radio frequencies are pretty easy for Russian defense systems to jam, so the UK has to prep backup scenarios to make sure the hundreds of thousands of drones they're sending don't just turn into a swarm of little bees falling out of the sky before getting the job done. While the UK is busy building up combat readiness for Ukraine, the Middle East is actually seeing a shrinking American military footprint. On April 16th, the last US Army unit officially emptied out the Kasarek military base in Hasaka province, Syria. American logistics convoys and heavy weaponry were pulled out toward the Jordanian border. Choosing this evacuation route through Jordan was all about avoiding unnecessary conflicts and threats from pro-Iran militias operating in Iraq, who often use suicide drones and rockets to target American convoys. Because of that, the southern route through Jordan was seen as a much safer corridor to protect their assets and military personnel. The exit of American forces closes a long 10-year chapter of their presence in Syria, a mission that was originally designed to wipe out the ISIS militant group. This departure follows the handover of two other major bases, Al-Tanf in the south and Al-Shaddadi in the northeast. The vacuum left by the US military was immediately filled by the 60th Division of the Syrian Arab Army. This combat formation is really unique and full of high-level political maneuvering. The majority of personnel in this division are Kurdish fighters from the Syrian Democratic Forces, or SDF, who had been Washington's main partners on the ground for years. The integration of Kurdish paramilitaries into the Syrian national military structure has been happening since the collapse of the Bashar al-Assad regime back in December 2024, which was later replaced by a new government under the leadership of President Ahmed al-Shara. Shara's government, which actually had backing from Washington, managed to hit a diplomatic sweet spot that people previously thought was impossible. They successfully convinced the SDF to hand over control of strategic areas like Raqqa and Deir el-Zor to the central government in Damascus. So, if we look at the big picture, the takeaway from both of these situations points to a massive shift in global military strategy. On one side of the world, the UK is trying incredibly hard to make sure Ukraine doesn't completely fall into Moscow's hands. By constantly upgrading and supplying these advanced systems, London is actively trying to contain the conflict and protect the broader security of Europe from Putin's long-term ambitions. At the same time, the UK is playing a really smart long game at home. They're securing local jobs, injecting huge capital into tech startups, and effectively training their domestic defense industry to operate under extreme pressure. They're making sure their supply chains are resilient, just in case the conflict expands and spreads across the European continent. By sending these logistics and attack drones into real-world conditions in Ukraine, British engineers are getting invaluable field data that you just couldn't simulate in a regular lab. They are actively figuring out how to beat advanced electronic warfare systems, and that knowledge is going to shape Western military doctrine for decades to come. Meanwhile, over in the Middle East, the dynamics are completely different. America is officially wrapping up a long and complex assignment in Syria. This withdrawal truly marks an end of an era. After 10 years of running a long, drawn-out mission against terror, Washington's strategic priorities are clearly shifting. They're moving away from counterinsurgency operations in the desert to focus on much bigger threats. But this departure definitely leaves behind a very fragile geopolitical landscape. The real test right now is whether the new Syrian government structure, along with the newly integrated SDF forces, can actually hold their ground and defend their territory. The hope is that Syria can finally secure its own borders using its regional strength without having to rely on a foreign military umbrella, especially now that American troops have completely pulled out. So, what do you guys think about this massive shift in global military dynamics? Do you think the UK's drone strategy will be enough to break the deadlock in Ukraine? And how do you see the future of Syria playing out without the presence of the American military? Drop your thoughts in the comment section below.